In our previous episode, we discussed how the dominant Western environmental discourse often imposes limitations on Africa's development. We explored how these limitations, in many ways, stifle the continent's potential for growth and prosperity. We delved into the complex narrative of environment versus development, a narrative that is often skewed by the West's perspective. Today, we expose how some of the world's most polluting countries prioritize their own growth over environmental standards. This is a tale of double standards and the quest for global environmental justice. First, let's look at China, the world's leading carbon dioxide emitter. Its industrial sector, particularly the steel industry, consumes vast quantities of coal. This results in a staggering release of CO2 into the atmosphere, with the Chinese steel industry responsible for a significant portion of these emissions. Moving on to America, it's globally recognized as a land of flourishing industries and tech-based firms. However, underneath this impressive facade, there's a worrisome reality. The United States fossil fuel industry, particularly its coal-burning power plants, are significant contributors to the nation's CO2 emissions. These power plants, environmental concerns continue to operate and spew out massive amounts of CO2. Next, let's take a look at Germany, which boasts Europe's biggest economy. Despite its reputation for green initiatives, Germany's reliance on coal-fired power plants, especially its lignite-based ones, is a major environmental concern. These power plants are significant contributors to the country's immense carbon footprint, despite the nation's advances in renewable energy. Finally, India, a rapidly nation with a soaring demand for energy. India's coal-based thermal power plants bear the brunt of the blame for the country's CO2 emissions. Despite the push for renewable energy, these power plants continue to operate at full scale, thereby contributing to the nation's growing carbon footprint. In conclusion, ClimateTrade.com S report, which states that particular regions emit massive amounts of CO2, is a grim confirmation of the environmental impact these nations have. It serves as a global environmental reality check. Germany, known as a leader in green energy, seems to be facing a challenge. Despite the country's ambitious green energy initiatives and its commitment to the Paris Agreement, its energy demand is on the rise. Renewable sources are struggling to keep up, and as a result, a somewhat unexpected solution is emerging. The nation is reviving dormant power plants to meet its energy needs. Furthermore, it's also importing more resources, particularly from Africa, to bolster its energy reserves. This resurgence is happening amid energy crises, reopening old plants, and boosting imports from Africa. These examples highlight the double standards in environmental commitments. Despite being self-proclaimed champions of the environment, Western nations continue to heavily rely on non-renewable energy sources, such as coal, for their industrial needs. Take Germany, for instance. Even though it positions itself as a leader in green energy, it has recently increased its coal reliance, reopening old plants and boosting coal imports from Africa amid energy crises. This contradicts the green rhetoric often put forth by Western nations. Now let's consider Africa. The continent collectively contributes less than 4% to global emissions. Despite this, African nations face stringent environmental scrutiny and regulations imposed by the international community, including those who contribute significantly more to global emissions. These strict environmental regulations often impede Africa's ability to develop and improve the living standards of its people. It's a classic case of do as I say, not as I do, where Western nations advocate for strict environmental standards, yet continue to rely on non-renewable energy sources. Is it fair to impose these stringent standards on African nations that contribute minimally to global emissions? Isn't it time we reconsider these double standards? African nations contributing less than 4% to global emissions face stringent environmental scrutiny, which impedes their development. While Western nations developed using coal and other non-renewables, Africa's journey remains distinct. The development story of the West is intrinsically linked to the exploitation of non-renewable resources. These nations built their economies on the back of coal and oil, reaping the benefits of industrialization. Now let's turn our gaze towards Africa. The continent is immensely rich in resources, yet it has not fully realized its potential. Africa's needs are vast, spanning across sectors such as healthcare, education, transport, and energy. To meet these needs, Africa must harness its natural resources, much like the West did during its development phase. However, the environmental constraints imposed by the West pose a significant challenge. This begs the question, shouldn't Africa have the same opportunities to develop as the West once did? With more development requirements than established economies, Africa's fight for equitable growth continues. African nations require notable economic growth to enhance their living standards. Although the continent is abundant in resources, many of its inhabitants still live in poverty. Why is that? The African economy is majorly agricultural, a sector that is to climate change and various environmental challenges. Simultaneously, the continent is blessed with a wealth of natural resources, including minerals, forests, and fossil fuels. These resources provide a potential route for industrialization and economic expansion, but their extraction and consumption often result in environmental degradation. This places African nations in a paradoxical situation. They need to utilize their natural resources to drive economic growth and elevate their people from poverty. However, this could potentially harm the environment and intensify the very climate change challenges they are most susceptible to. It's indeed a delicate balancing act. Moreover, the path to industrialization in Africa is obstructed by insufficient infrastructure and technology, coupled with the stringent environmental regulations imposed by the West. Interestingly, these very regulations were not in place when Western nations themselves were undergoing industrialization using their own resources. To sum up, industrialization through the utilization of available natural resources is key. The challenge, however, lies in achieving this sustainably and without causing detriment to the environment. Africa is a continent rich in biodiversity, home to unique ecosystems that hold immense value, not just for Africa, but for the entire planet. Here lies an often under-discussed issue: the developed world's historical and ongoing environmental impact. As Africa grapples with its own issues, the West continues to exploit similar resources. This is not an attempt to fingers, but a commentary on the uneven playing field. It's worth questioning the feasibility of foregoing industrialization while similar resources are being used by the West. This is not about absolving responsibility. It's about seeking fairness in the global context. Moving forward, Africa must shape its own environmental standards to encourage sustainable growth and cooperation between nations. The continent is rich in natural resources, and these should be harnessed in a way that promotes sustainable development, rather than exacerbating the current climate crisis. There is no one-size-fits-all approach to environmental policy. What works for the West may not necessarily work for Africa. The continent must forge its own path, one that is cognizant of its unique needs, challenges, and opportunities. This requires innovative thinking, robust policymaking, and concerted action. Africa must also foster regional cooperation. The continent is diverse, with over 50 countries each with their own unique environmental and developmental challenges. By working together, these countries can pool resources, share knowledge, and develop unified strategies that can drive sustainable development across the continent. Moreover, Africa must engage with the rest of the world in the climate change discourse. The continent contributes minimally to global emissions, yet it is among the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. Africa must advocate for fair and equitable global environmental policies that take into account its unique needs and circumstances. The road ahead is not easy, but it is not insurmountable. With the right policies, partnerships, and practices, Africa can achieve sustainable development while preserving its rich natural heritage. Encouraging sustainable growth and cooperation between nations is not just a noble goal, it is a necessity for the future of our planet. African leaders must advocate for equitable global environmental policies that recognize Africa's unique developmental needs. The current environmental discourse is predominantly shaped by countries that have already undergone industrialization. These nations, having reached a level of economic stability, can now afford to invest in green technologies. But Africa, still at an early stage of industrial development, faces a different set of challenges. Africa's leaders must champion a new narrative, a new approach that allows them to harness their available resources responsibly for development. This includes advocating for fair trade agreements, access to clean technology, and global cooperation that supports Africa's transition to a green economy. The continent's leaders must also promote internal policies that encourage sustainable practices. This includes investing in renewable energy, implementing strict regulations on pollution, and promoting education on environmental conservation. The world needs to understand that Africa is not asking for a free pass to pollute. Instead, Africa is asking for an equal opportunity to develop, to lift its people out of poverty, and to contribute to the global economy. Africa wants to be a partner in the global fight against climate change, not just a bystander. To achieve this, African leaders must advocate for policies that are not only environmentally sound, but also acknowledge Africa's right to development, recognizing Africa's unique developmental needs. Join us in redefining this narrative The environmental dialogue is not solely about West versus Africa or developed versus developing. It is about acknowledging that the pathway to sustainable development is not a uniform solution applicable to all. In the grand scheme, it's not just about singling out the most polluting nations or reprimanding those attempting to climb the economic ladder. It's about cultivating a dialogue that acknowledges the distinct challenges and aspirations of every nation, especially those of Africa. It's about realizing that Africa's growth need not replicate the industrial development of the West. We must pivot the conversation from blame and restrictions to collaboration and solutions. How can we assist Africa in utilizing its natural resources sustainably? How can we back the continent's endeavors to balance economic growth with environmental stewardship? These are the questions we need to. These are the discussions we need to engage in, because the environmental challenges we face are global. The solutions, hence, must be global too. We invite you to participate in this discussion. Contribute your thoughts, ideas, and perspectives. Let's create a dialogue that moves beyond the usual narratives and towards a more nuanced understanding of sustainable development. Because your voice is crucial, your engagement is vital. Join the conversation. It doesn't end here. We can shape the narrative and influence change together. Let's spread this critical dialogue far and wide, shedding light on Africa's unique environmental and developmental challenges. Advocate for Africa's future. Until next time, is the Future of Africa channel.